Hi, everybody. It's great for me to follow that last presentation. We're looking at socioeconomics, human dimensions, which is really broad. There's am I close enough? Everyone here? A variety of different human uses, and we wouldn't be able to capture them all with the budget that we had. And so the real focus of our project is on commercial and CPFV or charter fisheries. And I'm part of a big team. The PI lead on our project is Stephen Hackett from the economics department. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today. And Cheryl Tren from EcoTrust, 0.97, then EcoTrust again, was also involved in our project. And a couple of others, a grad student, Lucia Ordonez-Gauger, did a lot of work on this project. Noah Enlow from EcoTrust and Laura Casali. So we had a kind of a big team contributing to the effort. So our study, we have a 350-page report. We collected a ton of data, so there's a lot in there. I'm just going to kind of give you a snapshot of some of the different things we've collected, but if you want more detail, you can go to that report. We had four kind of big different components. First was a baseline characteristic of spatial fishing patterns and the socioeconomic status of commercial and CPFV fishermen. So kind of what are they doing now? What's their status now? So a bit of a baseline. We also tried to assess initial spatial and socioeconomic changes following MPA implementation. So when we did our study, the MPAs have been in for 2 years, so we get a little sense of sort of initial impacts, but again, it's a challenge since it hasn't been in that long to really distinguish them. A quantitative assessment of fishermen's perceptions of the ecology and management of the MPA network, which really parallels some work that the tribal project did. And we also incorporated some qualitative data in there to get a sort of a sense of sort of the historical context and perceptions of MPAs in focus group meetings in each of the major ports. So those are kind of the key of big components. So the methods that we used, the first thing we did was we established a Fishermen's Advisory Council to sort of oversee our project. The idea was that we didn't want to kind of impose this on the fishermen, but to have them involved. And so this included 8 representatives from commercial and charter fisheries, all of the different species of interest, and from all of the different major ports. And what they did was they provided input on the survey design, so we developed a survey tool, we got feedback. They helped us with outreach in ports, so they were kind of the person that would go and be like, these people are all right, and help us get surveys. And then when we collected data, they gave us input on if the data looks valid and also suggestions for why some of the patterns we were seeing were occurring. We did surveys with a tool very similar to what the tribal project discussed. It was on a laptop computer. And we did surveys with 163 commercial operators and 15 CPFV operators, almost 50% response rate. And it had some things that they would click, but there was a mapping portion, and so on the computer they would map things out, and I'll show that in a little bit. 5 focus groups, and an analysis of landings and logbook data. So just gathering some of the existing data to analyze. And as a part of that, Steve Hackett led a regulatory event study, which I'll describe a little bit in the end. And in terms of the scope, so we really focused on nearshore fish species. The key species that we looked at were Dungeness crab, urchin, nearshore finfish, which is kind of the rockfish cod complex, and salmon. So just to kind of give you a sense, does this have a, yeah. So this is kind of looking at some of the landings data to just give you a sense of what's happening in commercial fisheries on the North Coast. And the blue is sort of the pounds of fish landed, the yellow is the revenue, and the red is the number of fishermen. And this is something that we heard a lot about in focus group meetings, but you can see since the early 90s there's been a kind of a trend in decline. And actually we don't have data stretching further back, but when you hear accounts from fishermen it used to be even much higher than that pre-90s. So there's been a trend in decline, but I think something that's really interesting about 2009, it kind of hit a low and it's increasing a little bit. Sometimes there's a narrative in North Coast communities that commercial fishing is a dying field, and actually the data don't show that. It's kind of stabilizing and leveling out a little bit. Here's trends in charter fishing. So the blue line here is total number of vessels, and you can see it, it's been fairly stable, but increasing a little bit. And then recently there's been a little bit of a boon in the number of vessels operating on the North Coast. The average number of trips for vessels kind of peaked in 2006 and has declined a little bit. Another interesting data that we collected is just basic demographics of our sample, and this is for commercial fishermen. So average age and years of experience. What we've discovered is fishermen are getting kind of old. It's a phenomenon that we're seeing nationwide. It's often referred to as the graying of the fleet. And there's a real concern that a lot of fishermen are at or near retirement age, and sort of what's going to happen next when they retire. Are there young people to enter into the career? So the average age of a commercial fisherman is 54 with 30 years of experience. So we asked about, this was sort of their perceptions of impacts. So we asked fishermen, have you been affected by an MPA in the region? And 76% of them said yes. So 3/4 of them about have expressed some impact for MPAs, but not all of them have experienced an impact. And this shows it broken down by different species. The number one reason for why they were, different reasons why they've been affected by MPAs is because they cannot go and fish or go to traditional grounds or areas. So the fact that the MPAs are in locations that they used to fish. We asked about which MPAs had the most impact or most effect. And the 10-mile SMR, which is this red star down here, was by far the most frequently cited to have an effect. 77 commercial fishermen total. Of those, 43 were salmon and 18 were crab, and 4 CPFV reported some kind of effect. And then these other ones had some effect as well. So these are the ones that emerged with the most impact. And so part of what we did was collect spatial data, and they turn these into maps that represent relative value. And so what you do is you ask the fishermen to sit down and map by species, map their key fishing grounds. And so if there's 3 kind of spots that they fish, then they have 100 pennies that they allocate to those grounds based on the value that those grounds are to them. And so maybe they say, well, I have 2 fishing grounds and they're both equally of value, so I put 50 pennies here, 50 pennies here. Then what EcoTrust does is takes their landings data from that year and assigns that value based on the pennies. And so what it does is create sort of a relative spatial value of spots on the ocean. And they did this before the MPA network went in, and they took an average from 2000 to 2009. And then in 2013 we did it again, and we were able to take a look at has this sort of the value of areas shifted since MPA implementation. And I think the most noticeable trend you can see here, so this is a commercial Dungeness crab heat map for value, for change in value. So this is looking at how much is changed. And red areas are areas where the value has increased between that pre-MPA and post-MPA period. And green is areas where it's decreased. And not surprisingly, you can see where the MPAs went in, there's been a decrease in value because they can no longer fish there. We also asked fishermen some questions about their perception of management and ecology. I'm just going to show you a few. But here is this similar question that the tribes asked, and I think this is interesting. The answer is potentially a little different. Satisfaction with the inclusion of local input into the planning process. And we see that the answers here were really bifurcated. Sort of almost half were really satisfied and half dissatisfied, although of those that reported they were dissatisfied, they were more likely to say very dissatisfied. But interestingly, when you ask them about their satisfaction with the planning process just overall, we get a strong sense that commercial and charter fishermen were not satisfied with the process. So there's some pretty low opinions of the process, and can dig into a little more reasons why from some of the focus group conversations. The other thing that we did is we tried to measure trust. And so we asked the fishermen a series of statements, I trust, and then the name of a different management entity. And they rank their level of agreement with that statement. And here are the entities from least trust to most trust. And this yellow line here is neutral. So this is kind of the average response on that Likert scale. And what you're finding is that trust is really low in our fishing communities right now. The only two entities that even squeaked above neutral are university researchers, which we think there may be some bias since university researchers were doing the study and they didn't want to tell us that they don't trust us. We know that they didn't trust. It took a while to build trust with us through this project. And other North Coast fishermen, and if you know how fishermen sometimes feel about other fishermen, to know that agencies are falling below that means that there's a lot of work to be done. I think importantly, Ocean Protection Council down here is at the low end. There's potentially a little bit of confusion among fishermen on what that is, thinking that maybe it's an environmental NGO instead of a government entity. And the Marine Life Protection Act initiative that implemented MPAs, very low as well. We asked sort of about their perceptions of ecology, so we asked questions about what effect do fishermen think the North Coast MPA network will have on the health of this resource. And I think the common assumption is that all fishermen would say no effect. They're not going to benefit us at all. But what's really interesting is that when we asked that question on a species by species level, depending on what species it was, the answers were really different, which I think shows some really nuanced ecological thinking on behalf of fishermen. So we look at salmon and crab, which we both know are kind of migratory species that might move in and out of MPAs a lot. There is a lot of strong reporting that the effect would be neutral. For rockfish, however, a much more fishermen responded that they thought there might be a positive response to rockfish. And interestingly, on urchin, we see a lot of responses that they believe there'll be a negative effect on urchins. And this is because of a phenomenon that some urchin divers have seen called urchin barrens, where some protected areas, because there aren't sea otters, to harvest the urchins, that if humans aren't harvesting, urchins sort of take over an area, and then they become really kind of small, not commercially viable, and not as good. But some biologists can talk about the validity of that idea. But there may be some ecological basis for some of these responses. The focus group conversations, there's kind of three key themes that emerged. We could talk about this data for a while, but something fishermen expressed was the importance of the historical context and feeling like maybe the MPA process didn't really understand the state of fishing communities now, the types of regulations that they already have going on and that might interact with the network. And a lot of fishermen just talking about what it's been like to experience that decline that we saw in the graph of the industry really shrinking and losing infrastructure and processing facilities and those types of things that goes along with that. In terms of perceptions of the MPA effects and processes, fishermen said that in a lot of ways they felt lucky. The way the MPA network was designed would really limit their impacts, and so they're glad that the impacts are fairly limited, but they expressed that more MPAs or MPAs in different locations could have pretty big effects on them. And again, a lot of discussions about feeling like even though this was a participatory process, they didn't feel like that reaching out to include fishermen's input was really genuine, that there was kind of an idea ahead of time of what would be done. And so some fishermen described it as a railroad job. And then we discussed about visions for the future. And a couple of fishermen expressed an idea that they'd hope going forward that we could think about fisheries management not just about managing for the health of the species, but also for the health of the communities and economies that rely on that resource. And I think something that was really exciting that we've started to do in this MPA project is a lot of fishermen expressed a desire to collaborate with scientists. We had urchin divers saying, like, here's my boat, I will take you out. Like, I would love to show you the things that I am seeing. So I think the door is open, and it was surprising in all the ports we really were hearing that, and we didn't even directly ask that. So I think the door is open for some interesting collaborations. Really quickly, Steve Hackett did a regulatory event study on the urchin fishery. He picked that for a variety of reasons. And what we did was there was 37 urchin divers who had harvested urchins for 5 years pre-MPA and the 2 years post-MPA. And what he did was compare characteristics of those fishermen pre and post-MPA to see if there was any significant differences. And in terms of all the things that he tested for, there was no evidence for an MPA effect. And so this is fishing revenue, level of dependence on the fishery, and spatial dependence on the key ports of Fort Bragg and Albion. And here's a look at the data for income. And you can see actually there was a higher number of urchin divers whose income increased post-MPA. But you can see how complicated it is to figure this out. There's so many factors that are affecting fisheries. We had some really different weather patterns coming through. Fisheries are kind of rising and falling all the time, so it's really difficult to discern an MPA effect, especially this soon. The last thing that I want to talk about is a lot of what we did was, I just showed you 2 graphs, but we looked at this logbook and landings data. And what we decided is that we couldn't make all of the different graphs that different people would want. That there's, fishermen from Shelter Cove might want something, a fisherman from Eureka might want something, a scientist might want something else. So instead of just having a static report with 1 million graphs in it, what EcoTrust took the lead on doing is developing a data tool where anybody can access this data and make it in a graph that works for them. And I think this is one of the most exciting outputs of our project, and this is going to be on the Ocean Spaces website, and I'll give you just a little taste. And so it's this data viewer, and actually you can download, so there's a visualization tool, but you can download under the underlying data. And here there's a fisheries mapped by port group, and it's a little bit difficult to see, but it's sort of a heat map. This is looking at Dungeness crab, gross revenue by port in 1992, but you can select your year, and it's kind of showing that the North Coast ports are doing a lot, and when you cursor over the bubble, it tells you how much. And then you can do a port group summary, so you can pick a port or a group of ports. You can then select a year, and it'll tell you the gross revenue of that port, the number of fishermen. We're looking at Eureka here, the number of pounds landed, and the top fisheries by revenue. And again, you can download this data. And lastly, you can graph it and look at patterns over time. And so I selected the Fort Bragg area ports here. You can pick which species that you want to see, and it'll show you these trends. And here's pound landed, but it also has number of fishers and revenue. So this is a tool available for anyone to search data, to be able to see the different patterns that are going on, and we hope a wide variety of users might find it useful. And so that's kind of the conclusion of the study, some recommendations and next steps. One of the things we discovered is the importance of fishing community engagement. The advisory council system that we developed worked really well. We had a much higher response rate than other ports, and I think it's because of that model that we really kind of tried to build that trust in that way. We found some gaps in existing data collection, landing receipts, and logbooks. And the most important thing is the spatial data in terms of where fish are coming from. It's extremely expensive and labor intensive to make these spatial maps where you have to continue to interview fishermen each year. So some innovations in logbook data collection can maybe make that data more available. Socioeconomic monitoring metrics in the future, the one thing we would add is that perceptions is something that you can continue to monitor over time. And so you look at that trust. Well, an agency can make a lot of effort to build trust, and then they could go back, ask that question again, and see if they're making any headway. Commercial and CPFV fishing industries face a lot of challenges on the North Coast. We talked about the graying of the fleet, some of the declines in infrastructure, and we've actually leveraged the findings from this project to develop a next project that's starting this year to support fishing community sustainability planning in the ports of Eureka and Shelter Cove, to talk about, all right, here's where we're at, what are some ways we can improve the viability of our industry and our communities going forward. And with that, I'll take any questions.
we got time for one question, and then we're going to have a break, and we're going to shift our schedule by 5 minutes.
So you mentioned moving forward that there's an opportunity for engagement, but I guess I'm really curious. You talked about how there were big majorities in feeling very dissatisfied, and also the participation in the process. And I guess I'm really curious if for those who did participate, did you see any correlation to how they responded? Were they satisfied or dissatisfied? I guess I'm curious, really, participation correlation with satisfaction.
Well, we looked at that, and actually we collected data on number of days participating, and I think something like over 70% of our participants had spent at least one day in the process. So very different from the tribal results, which I think will be interesting to see. So Fisherman, talking to fishermen, their perceptions of the process, we can feel really confident isn't coming from just assumptions about what they thought it was, but actually they were involved in it. And that was an interesting finding to me, that by far the majority of our respondents had participated in the process for at least more than one day.